Let me ask you a question that has no real answer. What is the hardest boss in Monster Hunter? Maybe you're thinking to yourself, of course that has a real answer, it's Risen Shigaru, or have you fought Iceborne Fatalis? That's obviously the hardest one. And sure, those are certainly up there, but for just a moment, I want you to try to remember the first Monster Hunter game you played. In that game, I'd imagine there was likely a boss that brought your progress to a grinding halt. Your first wall. Try to think of how that fight made you feel. For me, that monster was Zamtrios in 4 Ultimate. It was so fast and aggressive, its attacks had such outlandish range, and the damage it dealt was higher than anything I had encountered up to that point. Oftentimes, I wasn't even sure what was going on. It almost felt like the opposite of the Matrix, where everything was happening too fast for me to process all of it. I truly could not figure out how to beat this thing, and I was stuck on it for days. My dual blades drained stamina when I used their strongest attack, so I frequently ran out and was unable to dodge out of the way. And when I got hit with the freeze debuff, I was practically certain to cart and go back to camp. To this day, I haven't had to spend more time on any boss than I did on 4U Zamtrios. Nothing has been that hard for me. But of course, that isn't because this is some unbeatable super boss. It's because it was my first experience with Monster Hunter. The sad thing about this then is that there's no way to ever get that feeling back, since it's directly caused by the fact that it was my first experience. As miserable as those fights were, that feeling of panicking and scrambling in this chaotic environment, then slowly and gradually learning and eventually surmounting this impossible obstacle can never exist again. That's true for me, and unfortunately, it's true for you too. But what if it wasn't? What if it were possible to use the mechanics of the game to artificially recreate that experience? What if it were possible to have that first experience a second time? These are the Arch-Tempered monsters. The lore is that they've survived for a particularly long time, and as a result have become exceptionally powerful. Naturally, this is reflected in their gameplay, as they're some of the hardest hunts in the game. What really stands out to me though, isn't simply their difficulty, but instead their specific attributes and qualities that almost make it seem like they're trying to recreate that feeling of your first wall. To understand what I mean by this, we need to isolate what really makes a wall feel distinct. I think it comes down to 3 qualities. First, there's the simple one, challenge. If a wall isn't challenging, it's not really a wall, is it? This is the most fundamental definition of what makes a wall, and it leads directly into the second quality. Walls necessitate some kind of increase in knowledge and understanding from the player. There needs to be something that you don't get about this fight that's preventing you from completing it. This can be as simple as the boss's attack patterns that you've yet to memorize, or skills and mechanics that you don't know how to fully take advantage of at this point. Think of things like an attack you haven't used properly, or a button you haven't pressed. For those not looking at the screen, this is a subtle and clever subscribe button joke. The third and final quality is a bit more difficult to pin down, but I describe it as chaos. There should be some kind of panicked and frantic feeling as a direct result of the challenge you face and your lack of knowledge. You should almost be afraid of this boss and what it can do. This last one is so important due to the contrast that it creates, since after you do finally beat that boss, it totally vanishes. You understand how to fight it, you know what both it and you are capable of, and you have no fear at all. The fight almost moves in slow motion as you perfectly and easily counter anything it can throw at you. So now that we understand the necessary qualities, go ahead and toss them in your complimentary mhswoocer folder for later, because once we zoom in and take a closer look at those Arch-Tempered monsters, we'll start to notice some familiar trends. Let's start with the fish. This is Arch-Tempered Udra. It's an aquatic monster that slides around the field and uses its size to... oh no. Mercifully, the normal version of this monster is quite slow. However, when it comes to the Arch-Tempered variant, we're not so lucky. While it's still the slowest of the 3, this monster has some wonderfully clever tricks that make it one of the most interesting fights in the game. It's got attacks where it'll charge forward with multiple consecutive swings, or my favorite, it'll catapult itself to the side with this barrel roll, effectively using its entire massive frame as a projectile. It can also use its prime Derrick Rose-esque athleticism to launch into the air just like in its normal form, but now the second slam has a hitbox roughly the size of Arizona due to the shockwave. Both of these attacks deal tremendous damage, and thanks to the monster's newfound speed, you really do have to stay on your toes for this entire hunt. Arch-Tempered Udra even takes advantage of its mastery over the water element by creating waves that can disrupt your movement. The most creative use of this is when it circles around to flank the hunter while creating a wave of water that pushes you in its direction. This combo is a brilliant way of demonstrating that experience that these Arch-Tempered monsters are supposed to have. Compare this to normal Udra's waves. These occur when the monster leaps into the air and then slams back down to the ground. These waves are less intentional. They just happen to enhance the attack. The Arch-Tempered waves, on the other hand, are a part of the attack. Udra no longer uses the water to supplement its offense in these waves that are basically just aftershocks, but instead creatively uses them to complement these moves by actively making them more difficult to avoid. Yet, that's not all it does with these waves. It no longer needs to do these huge dramatic flops to use them. Even the small swipes can cause waves that create one of my favorite parts of modern Monster Hunter, counter counters. No, that wasn't a bad take that I forgot to cut out. In short, a counter is when the monster monster swings twice in a row to punish the hunter's counter. Udra has a ton of these, like the double body slam or even its strongest attack, the double belly flop. It doesn't stop there though. It's got some that are especially unique when compared to most attacks like this. Oftentimes, instead of dealing damage, these follow-ups will merely push the hunter away. That might not seem particularly strong, but a lot of the counters in this game benefit dramatically from actually landing that follow-up attack. The switch axes counter is a great example of this. When you counter with swags, you gain these two follow-ups that fill about 25% of your sword gauge. If you get pushed away by a wave of water, you don't get to land your full counter, and you miss out on those 2 hits. All of this together creates that sense of chaos. The constant waves of water, the wild and erratic movements of the monster, and just the sheer size of some of these hitboxes along with the damage that they do. You really can't sit still for even a moment in this fight. It can feel difficult to catch your breath sometimes, since you practically always have to be on guard if you don't want this to turn into the first ever 2D Monster Hunter game. Yet the fight does still fall a bit short of that truly terrifying feeling of fighting an enemy you don't know how to beat. Part of this comes from the extremely telegraphed attacks. Sure, Udra is faster and more aggressive, but I've seen picture books harder to read than some of these swings. The monster will stand up on its hind legs for a moment, and you'll sit there and sarcastically go, huh, I wonder what it's gonna do next, before countering it into next week. And as I mentioned earlier, Udra is the slowest arch-tempered monster, making that an especially rudimentary task. So let's see if we can get a bit closer to that feeling by increasing the speed and adding in a few extra mechanics with the next monster. My personal favorite AT and my favorite new monster in the game, Raidao. The reason I love this fight so much all comes down to how perfect it feels in terms of addressing the player's strengths and wilds. See, through so much of this game, it feels like you have tools that your opposition can't respond to. On a fundamental level, a lot of these monsters have things like counters, but they often don't utilize them well enough to be a genuine threat. Take Chatacabra for example. He'll slam on the ground multiple times in a row and catch you with a counter if you parry too early. Once you learn how to count to a number larger than 2 though, you'll pretty much never get hit by that again. AT Raidao on the other hand does something similar to Duna in that it uses its lightning to complement its attacks. Almost every move this monster uses has an aftershock that'll severely punish the player if they get too aggressive. However, it goes a step further than punishing aggression by forcing the player to consider their positioning as well. Thanks to these aftershocks, you have to pay attention to where the monster currently is and where it was. You can't simply rush in after it swings, because if you find yourself in the same spot as that swing, you're likely to get hit by a lightning bolt. Now, these bolts don't deal very much damage, but they create terrifying combo possibilities due to the monster's speed and aggression. You see, AT Raidao has 3 mechanics that synergize perfectly together. First are the aftershocks that we just went over, and next is that speed and aggression. The monster has some of the longest combos in the game. It'll stab the ground with its horns, fire a quick railgun to launch itself into the air, then fire off 2 more lightning bolts before finally crashing into the ground with its wing. And remember, each and every one of these attacks has an aftershock, so countering any of them outside of that very last one isn't totally safe. The third and final mechanic that ties all of this together is Thunderblight. In Monster Hunter, there's this invisible meter that builds up when you get hit. If that meter maxes out, you'll get stunned and be unable to move for a while. Thunderblight significantly shortens that meter and allows the monster to stun you with far fewer hits. Now, you might already be able to put the pieces together as to why this is such a deadly combo, but with it comes something that Udra had as well, just to a less extreme degree. Let me explain. The aftershocks aren't meant to kill you, they're meant to stun you. They inflict Thunderblight and act as small hits that, along with the larger combo attacks, build up that stun gauge from before. Once the gauge is maxed out and you're wide open, that's why this is such a dangerous combo. Now, there are 2 ways you can avoid this. You can simply never get hit, a perfectly viable option if you're good enough, or you can replace that mechanical skill with the use of knowledge. There's endless variety in how you can build your character in Monster Hunter, and if you take advantage of that, you can play around those mechanics and completely change this fight. There are 2 skills you need to do this. First, Thunder Res. This is a skill that, at its highest level, makes the hunter immune to Thunderblight. Next is a skill called Stun Res, which does exactly what it sounds like, makes the hunter resistant to stun, and, much like Thunderblight, at the highest level, you become totally immune. With these 2 together, that deadly stun combo no longer exists, and all you have to worry about are the wing slams, the follow-ups, the lightning bolts, the wing slides, the tail slam, the combos, and the railguns. So it doesn't completely trivialize the fight, but that leads us perfectly into that idea of chaos. There's so much going on in this fight that it can sometimes be difficult to even tell what's happening. The environmental effects from the constant lightning bolts kick up dust and debris that almost partially blind you, creating these super frantic moments. You have no idea when these constant combos will end, especially on your first few attempts, and one miscalculation could be the last mistake you make. It all creates that very same thing I felt when I was fighting Zamtrios nearly a decade ago. That feeling of running around with your weapon sheathed, not knowing knowing when it's safe to go in and when you should keep your distance. Yet similar to Udra, Raidao falls just a bit short in one key way. Part of why Raidao is one of my favorite monsters is because of how honest the hunt feels. It's significantly faster than Udra, but despite that speed, everything is still clearly telegraphed and predictable. The monster has some sneaky follow-ups like the triple railgun and of course the aftershocks, yet once you understand how and when those follow-ups occur, the fight once again becomes quite comfortable and manageable. So now let's take things a step further to a monster that feels almost fundamentally unpredictable, a monster type that's one of the very first of its kind, and the newest Arch-Tempered monster added to the game. Arch-Tempered Nu Udra. Nu Udra is an outstanding fight, and while I imagine it must have been a technical nightmare to develop, the resulting monster is one of the most unique that we've ever seen in the series. It's only natural then that its Arch-Tempered version would be one of the best fights in the game, but does it accomplish that previously impossible task of recreating your first wall? Well, crack open that folder because we might have finally found it. Let's go down the list. First, the monster needs some kind of challenge. This one is pretty easy. Nu Udra has the ability to score from anywhere on the court. Sorry, basketball season just started and whatever. Check this out. This is Nu Udra, and this is the potential danger zone. It can easily attack at close to medium range with its 8 tentacles, and it can cover long range with its fire, or even quickly close the distance with one of its new Arch-Tempered attacks that sees it launch straight at the hunter. Now notice how even the monster itself is in that red zone? That's because when enraged, merely standing next to it will deal damage. Lastly, it's got this terrifying new attack that covers the ground in oil before detonating a massive fireball that lingers in the same place for a while. Assuming you miraculously survive the initial blast, the damage over time from the flames will quickly finish you off. Needless to say, this all creates a hunt that I'd say pretty comfortably checks that challenge box. Next up, we've got knowledge. We can rewind a bit to that fire aura from before to see this in action. Nu Udra has a combo that's similar to its fellow Arch-Tempered monster Raidao. The debuff Fire Blight will gradually lower your health, as will the lingering fire from the giant fireball from before. And of course, simply standing next to Nu Udra will cause you to take damage over time as well. When you combine any number of those three together, your health begins to plummet at a staggering rate. Yet once again, we can use skills to counteract this. The skill Adaptability is normally used against environmental hazards like extreme heat or cold, but against Nu Udra, it also nullifies the damage of its Fire Cloak. Fire resistance at the highest level nullifies Fire Blight too. This means that much like Raidao, this fight is substantially altered by having extra knowledge of the game's mechanics and using them to your advantage to turn the tables in your favor. So that's 2, leaving us with just one more criteria to fill. Chaos. Nu Udra's design by itself already gives it a huge advantage in this regard. A monster like Raidao has a similar enough skeleton to previous flying wyverns that you can reasonably predict how it'll behave, at least at a surface level with things like its movements. Nu Udra is technically the first of its kind in this series, so there's nothing to go off of in terms of muscle memory. No one has ever fought something like this in Monster Hunter before. Equally, even if we did have a bunch of cephalopods before this one, 8 is a bigger number than 4. There are just more threats to keep track of when a monster has 8 different things it can swing at you. The developers knew this too, and so they added in this little tell where Nu Udra will show off the blue part of its tentacles right before it attacks to let the player know where that attack is coming from. This helps, but that feeling of chaos never really goes away. The monster can attack from any angle, regardless of whether it's facing you or not, and thanks to its ability to string together multiple swings in a row, even guarding against it or super armoring through its attacks can be extremely risky. So with that, they finally pulled it off. Arch-Tempered Nu Udra checks all of the boxes and recreates that feeling of your first wall. At least, it tries to. It's just that for some reason, it doesn't quite get there either. Why is it that despite checking all the boxes, something still feels off? By every metric, this should create that same feeling, and yet it doesn't. Well, I think it goes back to that idea from the very start. When you first encountered that wall, there was something new, unexpected, novel, and exciting about it. By its very nature, you had never seen something like this before. Even if an evil witch showed up and removed all of your skill without removing your memories and made you refight that same boss, I'm willing to bet it still wouldn't create that exact same feeling. And I think that's okay. That first experience was special, it was important and significant. That doesn't mean it's the only thing that matters though. You'll never play your first Monster Hunter game again. You'll never stumble through an experience that feels impossibly challenging to overcome like you did in your first game in the series. However, that doesn't mean you'll never have to plan, strategize, and practice against another boss again. I mean, sure, the Arch-Tempered monsters aren't a one-to-one recreation of what you fought nearly a decade ago, but they're pretty close. That feeling of going from a frantic scramble to a careful, precise dance where you've mastered each and every step does still exist. That feeling of creating a perfectly tailored build to counter their strengths and exploit their weaknesses is as strong as it was back then, if not even stronger thanks to the knowledge you now have of the series. In fact, Even that feeling of not fully understanding your weapon and having to really master it before you could overcome that wall exists with the arch-tempered monsters as well. These monsters are so aggressive, hit so hard, and utilize so many tricks and traps that you'll be pretty severely punished if you don't truly understand how to use your weapon. These fights will teach you things that you didn't even know you could do, and force you to use these tactics that you've never considered. Using the lance, for example, I can pretty much turn my brain off and shield against any monster in the game, but certain monsters, especially these arch-tempereds, won't allow that. Those flames from Nu Udra will tear through your health way too quickly for you to just sit there and block everything. I can't mindlessly counter everything with longsword against Raydao because of the near endless follow-ups that it has access to. Even Uthduna, as predictable as it may be, will punish you if you don't respect its hitboxes. Ultimately, while these monsters, along with every other monster in the series, will never truly capture that feeling you had against your first wall, it's important to be able to appreciate these exceptional fights for what they are, instead of lamenting them for something that they could never be. On a similar note, maybe we're focusing on difficulty a bit too much, and maybe that's taking away from more important experiences in games. Check out this video on that.